I never thought I'd be the kind of person who could blow up her own life. My name is Anna, and until a few months ago, I thought I was living a perfectly ordinary existence. I had a husband, Mark, who worked hard to give us a good life, 2 wonderful kids who were my world, and a comfortable home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. From the outside, everything looked picture perfect. But inside, I was quietly unraveling. It started innocently enough, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. Our neighbor, Greg, was friendly and charming in a way that made him the neighborhood favorite. He'd moved in a year ago after his divorce, and he quickly became the go-to guy for fixing fences, hosting barbecues, and chatting over the mailbox. At first, our interactions were nothing out of the ordinary, just small talk about the weather or complaints about the trash pickup schedule. But somewhere along the way, those conversations shifted. Greg had a way of making me feel seen, in a way Mark hadn't in years. It wasn't Mark's fault, he worked long hours and was always stressed, trying to provide for our family. But I'd started to feel invisible, lost in the endless cycle of parenting, chores, and maintaining the facade of the perfect wife. Greg noticed things about me. He complimented my laugh, remembered the little details I'd mentioned in passing, and always seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. At first, it was just nice to feel appreciated, to have someone who paid attention. But then the compliments became more personal, the conversations more intimate. One evening, after the kids were in bed and Mark was working late, I found myself sitting on Greg's porch, a glass of wine in hand. "You deserve to be happy, Anna," he said, his voice low and steady. "I am happy," I replied automatically, though even as I said the words, they felt hollow. Greg raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. "Are you?" The question lingered in the air between us, and I realized I didn't have an answer. That night was the first time I let myself admit that something was missing in my marriage. But it wasn't the last time I sat on Greg's porch. Over the next few weeks, our friendly chats became a regular occurrence. I told myself it was harmless, that I just needed someone to talk to. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a line. And then, one evening, the line disappeared altogether. It happened so fast, I could barely process it. One moment, we were sitting on his porch, laughing over some silly joke. The next, his hand was on mine, and I wasn't pulling away. When he kissed me, it was like a dam breaking, months of pent-up frustration and loneliness spilling out in a rush of emotion. I wish I could say I stopped it there, that I came to my senses and walked away. But I didn't. The affair lasted for months, hidden in plain sight. Greg and I found excuses to spend time together, a trip to the hardware store, a morning jog around the neighborhood, a quick drink after the kids went to bed. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once, and I convinced myself that no one would ever find out. But secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how carefully you try to hide them. One night, as I was putting the kids to bed, Mark came home earlier than expected. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and he barely looked at me as he walked past. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't dare ask. It wasn't until later, when the kids were asleep and we were alone in the living room, that he confronted me. "How long have you been lying to me?" he asked, his voice cold and sharp. My heart stopped. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't," he snapped, his eyes blazing. "Don't insult me by pretending. I know about you and Greg." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Mark, I don't," he said again, his voice shaking. "Just tell me the truth." I tried to explain, to apologize, to beg for his forgiveness, but nothing I said seemed to matter. He was furious, heartbroken, and completely done. "I want you out of this house," he said finally, his voice like steel. "And the kids are staying with me." "Mark, please," I sobbed. "Don't do this. Let's talk about it." "There's nothing to talk about," he said, his face hard. "You made your choice, Anna. Now you have to live with it." The next morning, I packed my things and left, my heart breaking as I kissed my kids goodbye. I didn't know where I was going or what would happen next. All I knew was that my life would never be the same. Leaving my home felt like walking away from a life I'd spent years building, one that I destroyed with my own choices. Mark hadn't given me much time to pack. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, watching as I filled a single suitcase with clothes and toiletries. I wanted to say something, to ask for another chance, but the look on his face stopped me. There was nothing left to say. When I closed the door behind me, I felt a wave of nausea. My car, parked on the quiet suburban street, felt more like an escape pod than transportation. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the house that had once been mine. The lights in the kids' bedrooms were still on, and I imagined them lying in bed, wondering why Mommy had left. With nowhere else to go, I drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was a place to hide from the reality of what I'd done. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to call Greg, to hear a voice that didn't carry anger or blame. But I couldn't bring myself to dial his number. Greg. The man who'd been at the center of everything I'd lost. It was ironic, he'd promised me excitement, validation, and connection, but in the end, all he'd given me was a hollow version of what I thought I wanted. The first few days were a blur. I called my job to let them know I'd be taking some personal time, but I didn't explain why. I spent hours scrolling through old photos on my phone, pictures of the kids' birthdays, family vacations, and quiet moments at home. Every image was a reminder of what I'd thrown away. Mark didn't call, and neither did the kids. I tried texting him once, asking how they were, but his response was curt, "They're fine. Don't contact us right now." His words stung, but I understood. I didn't deserve his kindness. Eventually, I forced myself to leave the motel room. I couldn't stay hidden forever, and I needed to figure out my next steps. I found a small apartment to rent, a one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a view of a parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first time I tried to set it up, I realized how much of my life had been tied to my family. Every dish, every piece of furniture, every decoration, it had all belonged to Mark, the kids, or the home we'd built together. My new apartment was a blank slate, but instead of feeling free, I felt empty. Work became my escape. I threw myself into every task, staying late to avoid the silence of my apartment. My co-workers noticed the change, but I deflected their questions with vague excuses about personal issues. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Karen, the nosy woman from down the street, had apparently taken it upon herself to spread the news of my affair. I'd catch glimpses of neighbors whispering as I drove past or see pointed stares when I went to the grocery store. One evening, as I was leaving work, I ran into Greg in the parking lot. He looked the same, confident, charming, but the sight of him made my stomach turn. "Anna," he said, his voice soft. "Don't," I replied, holding up a hand. "Just don't." "I'm sorry," he said, stepping closer. "I didn't mean for things to get so out of control." "Out of control?" I repeated, my voice trembling with anger. "I lost my husband, my kids, and my home, Greg. That's more than out of control." He looked taken aback, as though he hadn't considered the full weight of what had happened. "I didn't mean for you to get hurt," he said. "Did you think about anyone else?" I asked, my voice breaking. "My kids? My husband? You ruined everything, Greg." Tears streamed down my face as I turned and walked away. For the first time, I realized how much anger I had been carrying, not just at Greg, but at myself. I had allowed this to happen. I had made the choices that led me here. The next morning, I called a therapist. I didn't know how to fix my life, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. My first session was hard, harder than I expected. I admitted to the affair, the lies, and the guilt that had consumed me. You need to forgive yourself, my therapist said gently. I don't know if I can, I replied. Forgiveness doesn't mean excusing what you did, she explained. It means recognizing that you're human and that you have the ability to change. Her words stayed with me, though I wasn't sure I believed them yet. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, I began to rebuild. I started cooking again, filling my tiny apartment with the smells of homemade meals. I decorated with thrift store finds, making the space feel less like a temporary hideout and more like a home. But the hardest part was being away from the kids. I hadn't seen them since the day I left, and every night, I imagined what they were doing, if they missed me, if they hated me. I wanted to call, to write, to show up on their doorstep, but I didn't want to make things harder for them. Then, one day, I got a text from Mark, "We need to talk." Mark's text, "We need to talk," was both a relief and a terror. It had been months since I'd seen him or the kids, and in that time, I had been consumed by guilt and regret. I'd hoped for this moment, dreamed of some kind of reconciliation, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure I was ready. I replied cautiously, "When and where?" His response was quick, "Tomorrow at 2 p.m. The park by the kids' school." The park. Neutral ground. It made sense, but it also set the tone. I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. The next day, I arrived early, my heart pounding as I sat on a bench and waited. The playground was full of children laughing and playing, and I couldn't help but imagine my own kids among them. I'd missed so much: soccer games, bedtime stories, school projects, and the thought of how much I'd lost brought tears to my eyes. When Mark arrived, he looked as composed as ever, but there was a hardness to his expression that hadn't been there before. He walked over and sat down beside me, leaving a few feet of space between us. "Thank you for meeting me," I began, my voice trembling. "I'm not here for you, Anna," he said, his tone cold. "I'm here because the kids are asking questions." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "What kind of questions?" "They want to know why you left," he said, his eyes fixed on the playground. "They want to know if you're ever coming back." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What did you tell them?" I asked softly. "I told them you needed some time away," he replied. "That you love them, but you had to sort some things out." Tears welled up in my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "Don't thank me," he said sharply, finally turning to look at me. "Do you have any idea how hard this has been for them?" "For me?" "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I think about it every day. I know I hurt all of you, and I'll never forgive myself for that." Mark shook his head, his jaw tight. "This isn't about forgiveness, Anna. It's about what happens next." "I want to see them," I said quickly, the words spilling out before I could second-guess them. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. Just let me see them." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable. "They deserve answers," he said finally. "But I don't know if you're ready to give them." "I am," I insisted, my hands trembling. "I'll tell them whatever they need to hear. I'll take responsibility. Please, Mark." He studied me for what felt like an eternity before nodding. "Okay," he said. "But it's on my terms. You'll see them at my house, and I'll be there the whole time. If I feel like this is too much for them, or for you, it's over. Understood?" "Understood," I said quickly, relief flooding through me. The next day, I arrived at Mark's house for the first time since he'd thrown me out. It looked the same, perfectly maintained, with flowers blooming in the garden and toys scattered across the front yard. But it didn't feel like home anymore. Mark opened the door, his expression guarded. "They're in the living room," he said, stepping aside to let me in. When I walked into the room, Owen and Lily looked up, their faces a mix of surprise and confusion. For a moment, none of us said anything, and then Lily ran to me, throwing her arms around my waist. "Mommy," she cried, her voice filled with emotion. I knelt down, holding her close as tears streamed down my face. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered. "I missed you so much." Owen, who was older and more reserved, hung back, his expression uncertain. "Why did you leave?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling. The question broke my heart, but I knew I had to answer. "I made a mistake," I said honestly, my voice shaking. "A big mistake. And I hurt Daddy and all of you. I'm so sorry, Owen." His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought he might run away. But then he came forward, wrapping his arms around me as well. "I missed you," he said softly. We spent the afternoon together, playing board games and talking about everything I'd missed. It was bittersweet, wonderful to be with them again, but painful to see how much they'd grown without me. When it was time to leave, Lily clung to me, tears streaming down her face. "Don't go, Mommy," she pleaded. "I'll be back soon," I promised, my heart breaking. Mark watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "We'll see how this goes," he said as I walked to my car. "Thank you," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. The drive home was a blur, my emotions swirling between hope and despair. I had taken the first step toward rebuilding my relationship with my children, but I knew there was still a long way to go. Seeing my children again filled a void I hadn't realized was so deep. Their hugs, their laughter, and even their questions brought a mix of joy and pain. But I knew that one visit wasn't enough. Rebuilding their trust, and Mark's, would be a long, uphill climb, and I had to be ready for every step of it. Mark's terms were clear: I could visit the kids once a week at his house, supervised, until he felt comfortable extending more freedom. It wasn't ideal, but it was more than I deserved, and I was determined to make the most of it. The following Saturday, I arrived at Mark's house with a batch of cookies I'd baked the night before. It was a small gesture, but I wanted the kids to know I was thinking about them even when I wasn't there. When I stepped inside, Lily ran to greet me, her face lighting up with excitement. "Mommy's here," she called, grabbing my hand and pulling me into the living room. Owen was more reserved, sitting on the couch with a book in his lap, but he smiled when he saw me. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "Hi, sweetheart," I replied, my heart swelling. The visit was smoother than I expected. We played games, talked about school, and laughed at Lily's stories about her new friend who had the biggest dog in the world. Mark stayed in the background, watching silently as we interacted. I could feel his eyes on me, measuring every word, every gesture, but I tried not to let it rattle me. When it was time to leave, Lily clung to me again, her tears breaking my heart. "Can't you stay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll be back soon," I promised, kissing her forehead. As I walked out to my car, Mark followed me, his expression unreadable. "That went better than I expected," he said finally. "Thank you for letting me see them," I said sincerely. He nodded but didn't say anything else, turning back toward the house without a word. Over the next few weeks, the visits became a routine. Each time, the kids seemed a little more at ease, and even Owen, who had been hesitant at first, began to open up. He told me about his science project, his favorite new video game, and how he'd scored a goal in his last soccer match. "You'd have been so proud, Mom," he said one afternoon, his face beaming. "I am proud," I said, my throat tightening. "I'm so proud of you, Owen." Each visit ended the same way, with Lily crying as I left and Owen giving me a quiet hug. But I could feel the bond between us slowly mending, one small interaction at a time. Mark, however, remained distant. He was polite but curt, and he avoided any unnecessary conversation. I couldn't blame him, his wounds were still fresh, and I knew it would take more than weekly visits to repair the damage I'd done. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Mark surprised me by asking if I wanted to stay for coffee. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. I followed him into the kitchen, nervous but hopeful. We sat at the table, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "The kids are doing better," he began, stirring sugar into his coffee. "They're happy to see you." "That means everything to me," I said softly. "But this doesn't change what happened," he continued, his gaze sharp. "You broke their trust, and mine. It's going to take a long time to fix that." "I know," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't hate you, Anna," he said finally. "But I don't know if I can ever forgive you." His words stung, but I nodded, knowing he was being honest. "I understand," I said quietly. The next few weeks brought more progress. I started helping with the kids' school projects, attending their soccer games, and even joining them for dinner once in a while. The more time we spent together, the more I felt like part of their lives again. But the shadow of my mistakes never fully disappeared. Karen, the neighborhood gossip, continued to spread whispers about my affair, and I caught glimpses of judgment from other parents at the soccer field. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the moments that mattered, the way Lily's face lit up when I cheered for her, or the quiet conversations I shared with Owen on the car ride home. Mark remained cautious, but I could see him softening, little by little. One evening, as we sat together at the kids' soccer game, he turned to me and said, "You're doing better, Anna. The kids are happier with you around." His words brought tears to my eyes, but I held them back, nodding. "Thank you," I said, my voice trembling. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. Every week brought small victories and lingering challenges. My visits with Owen and Lily grew more natural, the awkwardness replaced by the kind of easy comfort I thought I'd lost forever. We played games, watched movies, and spent time in the backyard, where their laughter reminded me why I was fighting so hard to make things right. But progress wasn't linear, and there were moments when the weight of what I'd done felt almost unbearable. At times, Owen would retreat into silence, his expression clouded with emotions he didn't know how to express. Lily, ever eager to please, would cling to me as if afraid I might disappear again. And through it all, Mark remained a quiet, watchful presence, his guarded demeanor a constant reminder of the trust I'd shattered. One Saturday, as I helped Owen with a science project in the kitchen, Lily ran in, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Look, Mommy," she said, thrusting it into my hands. It was a drawing of the four of us, a stick-figure family standing under a bright sun. She'd written Mommy, Daddy, Owen, and me, in big, uneven letters across the top. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Do you like it, Daddy?" she asked, holding it up for Mark to see. Mark hesitated, his gaze flicking to me before he nodded. "It's great, Lily," he said, forcing a smile. The moment was bittersweet, a reminder of what we'd once had and what we were trying to rebuild. As the weeks passed, I started to feel like I was truly becoming part of their lives again. Mark invited me to join them for a family outing to the zoo, and though the day was filled with subtle tension, it was the first time we'd all been together outside the house since I'd left. At one point, as we watched the kids feed the giraffes, Mark turned to me. "They're happier with you here," he said quietly. "I'm glad," I said, my heart swelling. But for every step forward, there were reminders of the past. At a school event, I caught sight of Karen whispering to another parent, her pointed glance in my direction making it clear I was the topic of conversation. I kept my head high, refusing to let her judgment derail the progress I'd made, but the sting of her words lingered long after I left. Mark noticed my mood that evening and asked what was wrong. When I told him about Karen, he frowned. "You can't control what people say," he said. "All you can do is focus on the kids." He was right, of course, but it didn't make the whispers any easier to ignore. One evening, after the kids were in bed, Mark and I found ourselves sitting in the living room, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. You've been doing better, he said finally, breaking the quiet. Thank you, I said, surprised by the compliment. I'm still angry, he admitted, his voice steady. And I don't know if that will ever fully go away. But I can see how hard you're trying, and I appreciate that. His words were like a lifeline, a small glimmer of hope in the midst of uncertainty. I'll never stop trying, I said softly. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. We'll see, he said. Over time, Mark began to include me in more of the kids' lives. I started attending parent-teacher conferences, cheering from the sidelines at soccer games, and helping with homework. Each moment felt like a step toward redemption, a chance to prove that I could be the mother they deserved. But as my relationship with the kids grew stronger, my relationship with Mark remained tenuous. He was polite and cooperative, but the warmth that had once defined our partnership was gone. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, I finally worked up the courage to ask him how he felt about the progress we'd made. I think we're doing what's best for the kids, he said, his tone measured. And for us? I asked cautiously. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. I don't know, he admitted. I think we're learning how to be parents again. But as for us, I'm not sure there's an us anymore. His words hurt, but they weren't unexpected. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I understand, I said. For now, I had to focus on what I could control, being there for Owen and Lily, showing up for them in every way I hadn't before. I couldn't change the past, but I could fight for a better future, even if it meant letting go of the idea of reconciling with Mark. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Co-parenting with Mark was an exercise in restraint. Our interactions were polite, but beneath the surface, there was a tension neither of us could fully ignore. The kids were the glue holding us together, and for their sake, we did our best to keep things civil. Saturday mornings became a routine, would arrive at the house, spend the day with Owen and Lily, and share brief, careful conversations with Mark in between. He never left us alone for long, and though I understood his reasons, it was a constant reminder of how far we'd drifted apart. One weekend, as I was helping Lily with an art project at the kitchen table, Owen sat down beside me, his expression unusually serious. Mom, he said quietly, why can't you just move back in? The question caught me off guard, and I glanced at Mark, who had been leaning against the counter. His face was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. It's complicated, sweetheart, I said carefully. But I promise, no matter where I live, I'll always be here for you and your sister. Owen frowned, clearly unsatisfied with my answer. But other parents live together, he said. Why can't you and Dad? Mark stepped in before I could respond. Your mom and I are trying our best to figure things out, he said, his tone gentle but firm. But some things take time. Owen nodded slowly, though the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. After the kids went to bed, I stayed to talk to Mark. I'm sorry about earlier, I said. I didn't know what to say. It's not your fault, he replied, his voice heavy. They're confused, and I don't blame them. Honestly, I'm confused too. His admission surprised me. For months, Mark had seemed so resolute, so sure of where we stood. Hearing him express doubt made me wonder if there was still a chance to salvage what we'd lost. Do you ever think about us? I asked cautiously. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. I think about what we had, he said. And I think about how much I loved you. But then I remember what happened, and it's like hitting a wall. His words were like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, understanding his pain. I'm so sorry, Mark, I said, my voice trembling. I'll never stop being sorry. I know, he said, his tone softening. And I believe you mean that. But forgiveness doesn't fix everything. The conversation hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, I truly understood that rebuilding our family didn't necessarily mean rebuilding our marriage. The next few weeks were a roller coaster of emotions. Owen and Lily continued to grow closer to me, their laughter and hugs a constant reminder of why I was fighting so hard. But with Mark, the progress was slower. He remained guarded, and though we occasionally shared moments of connection, there was always a distance between us. One evening, after a school event where we'd sat together for the first time in months, Mark surprised me by suggesting we grab coffee. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious but not unkind. At the coffee shop, we sat across from each other, the hum of conversation around us providing a strange sense of normalcy. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Mark began, stirring his drink. "About us?" "And?" I asked, holding my breath. "I don't think I can go back to the way things were," he said carefully. "Too much has happened, and I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I nodded. "I understand," I said quietly. "But," he continued, "I do think we can find a way to be a family again. Not the way we were, but something new." His words brought a mix of relief and sadness. I wanted more. I wanted the life we'd had before everything fell apart, but I knew that wasn't realistic. "I'd like that," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. From that moment on, we began to redefine what it meant to be a family. We spent more time together with the kids, attending their soccer games, hosting family dinners, and even going on outings to the park. The tension between Mark and me never fully disappeared, but it softened, replaced by a mutual respect and a shared commitment to our children. One evening, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Mark turned to me. "You've come a long way, Anna," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Thank you," I said, surprised by the compliment. "I don't know what the future holds," he continued. "But I think we're on the right path." His words were a small but meaningful step toward healing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I was ready to face it, one step at a time. As the months passed, the pieces of my life began to fall into a pattern, not the one I'd envisioned when Mark and I first built our home together, but one that felt sustainable, even hopeful. Co-parenting with Mark had its challenges, but we were making it work for the kids. Owen and Lily seemed happier, their laughter filling the spaces that had once felt hollow. I found a new rhythm in my small apartment, decorating it with their artwork and filling it with memories of our weekends together. It wasn't the home they'd grown up in, but it was ours, a place where I could start to redefine what it meant to be a mother. Mark and I continued to navigate the fragile balance of our relationship. We weren't friends, exactly, but there was a mutual understanding between us, a recognition of the love we still shared for our children and the desire to give them the stability they deserved. One afternoon, as we sat in the stands at one of Owen's soccer games, Mark turned to me. "I've been thinking about what you said a while back," he began, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "About us?" I asked, surprised. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the field. "I don't think we'll ever be what we were," he said carefully. "But I think we're finding something new. Something better for the kids." His words were bittersweet, a reminder of both what we'd lost and what we were building. "That's all I want," I said softly. After the game, we took the kids out for ice cream, sitting together at a small table while they laughed and joked about school. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental, a glimpse of the family we were trying to become. But as much as things were improving, there were still moments of tension. Karen, the ever-watchful neighbor, continued to spread whispers about my affair, and though Mark never acknowledged it, I could tell the rumors bothered him. One evening, as we walked back to our cars after a school event, he finally brought it up. "Does it ever bother you, what people say?" he asked. "Of course it does," I admitted. "But I can't change the past, Mark. All I can do is focus on the present." He nodded thoughtfully. "I think people see the effort you're making," he said. "Even if they don't say it." His words meant more than I could express, a small but significant sign of his growing trust. As the holidays approached, Mark surprised me by suggesting we celebrate together. For the kids, he said, his tone casual but his expression serious. I'd like that, I replied, my heart swelling. We spent Christmas morning at his house, opening presents and sharing breakfast as a family. The kids were overjoyed, their excitement filling the room as they tore through wrapping paper and showed off their new toys. At one point, as I watched Mark help Owen assemble a model airplane, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the life we'd once had. But instead of dwelling on the past, I focused on the present, the laughter, the love, and the connection we were rebuilding. That evening, after the kids were asleep, Mark and I sat on the couch, sipping cocoa and reflecting on the day. You've done a lot of good, Anna, he said, his voice sincere. Thank you, I said, tears welling in my eyes. I still have my doubts, he admitted. But I think we're on the right path. For the kids, and for us. His words were a reminder that healing wasn't a straight line, but a journey. And for the first time, I felt like we were walking that journey together. The months that followed brought more small victories. Mark and I continued to co-parent, finding a rhythm that worked for us and for the kids. I started volunteering at their school, building relationships with other parents and showing Owen and Lily that I was committed to being present in their lives. Through it all, I held on to the lessons I'd learned, the importance of honesty, the power of forgiveness, and the value of fighting for what truly matters. As I stood in my apartment one evening, looking at the pictures of Owen and Lily that lined the walls, I felt a sense of peace. My life wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but I knew I was on the right path. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a future worth fighting for, a future filled with love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of family.